And we are welcoming Reverend Paul Johnson, our minister, who has given us many great sermons, including, I'm sure, this one, the humorous and the religious. Reverend Johnson, whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Beth. And good morning, everyone. Great to see you. You know, I grew up in a church which practiced adult baptism by total immersion in the baptismal tank. Oh, there we go. And it was a sacred, solemn ritual. Yet when I was in my teenage years, I heard some ministers share a humorous story about baptism. It so happens that a church with a newly built sanctuary was going to hold their first baptismal ceremony in their new facility, but they didn't have the dressing rooms built as yet on each side of the baptistry, the women on one side and the men on the other side. And so they had put up some temporary curtains on either side. Well, it so happens that as one of the women was coming up out of the baptistry, she slipped on one of the steps and pulled down that whole curtain arrangement, exposing a totally naked man to the whole congregation. Well, startled at this sudden exposure to everyone, he jumped right into the baptismal tank. Well, the ministers had a great good laugh over the story, which was told with extensive documentation as to the actual church and the minister. In fact, I actually knew the minister involved, and I admit that I laughed a bit myself, but I felt guilty at laughing. My adolescent sensibilities were challenged, if not outraged. How could these men of God laugh at such an unfortunate incident? Baptism was no laughing matter. Religion was no laughing matter. Well, my adolescent reluctance in this situation had ample precedent. The first century church father, John Chrysostom, said, "Laughter does not seem to be a sin, but it can lead to sin." The Roman philosopher Cicero claimed that laughter had its origins in meanness or deformity. Bergson claimed that the function of laughter was intimidation. And of course, in the sphere of religion, the Catholic ideal of asceticism, the grim Protestant ethic, and the austere Puritan mind, all at one point or another have cast aspersions on humor or raucous laughter. One of my favorite orators was the 19th century agnostic Robert Ingersoll, who complained that laughter has always been considered a crime by the theologians. He said, in the prayer books, there is no petition for a sense of humor. Back in my seminary days, admittedly many years ago now, there was not a single course on humor. Now that's quite an indictment of religion, because as you think of it, laughter is a distinguishing characteristic of humans, who are claimed by some to be the only animals who laugh. I don't know if I fully believe that. I had a dog named Tippy when I was a boy who I was sure was laughing at me on occasion. But as the late Unitarian minister A. Paul Davies wrote, with the emergence of fuller consciousness and the dawn of mentality, with the coming of the power of mind, life suddenly lifts up its voice and laughs. And certainly religion should take note of that. And that's going to be the brunt of my sermon this morning. But before I get into that, why do we laugh? I remember a number of years ago reading the book, The Enjoyment of Laughter by Max Eastman, and he floats several theories. The first is the Incongruity Theory. Take, for instance, an ad which appeared in a small Kansas newspaper a number of years ago. A young eligible farmer wants to meet a marriageable girl with a tractor, it said. Please send picture of tractor. Now, the shock and surprise of that ending causes us to laugh. It's almost a physical thing, isn't it? The second thing mentioned by Max Eastman is a superiority or derision theory, which was floated way back in the 17th century by Thomas Hobbes, who claimed that laughter is a sudden glory we perceive when we observe the infirmities or problems of others compared with our own superiority. And of course, this may be true on occasion. A third is that it's a release and a liberation. Jesting is one way people put up with what otherwise would be intolerable. And I thought this would be a good sermon, but all we put up with in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the war in Ukraine, we need some comic relief today, right? Hopefully. Hope it's not too soon, as it's often said. And then there's the pleasure theory. People laugh simply because it's pleasurable. You know, even young children laugh because it's fun. So to a degree, I suppose, humor is to be enjoyed and not fully understood. But I have been interested. Why do we laugh? I'll give you some suggestions. Well, how do religion and humor relate? First of all, both have a therapeutic role. Religion traditionally has been a means of reducing anxieties and the threats of existence. And I believe the same is true of humor. The book of Proverbs in the Hebrew scriptures says it so well. A merry heart doeth good like a medicine. Some of you probably remember back to the book Anatomy of an Illness in 1964 by Norman Cousins. He was editor of the Saturday Review, but he was suffering at that point from a terrible disease, ankylosing spondylitis, a degenerative disease of his connective tissue. And the doctors told him that he soon would have to choose between sitting up and lying down for the rest of his life, that he had one chance in 500 of recovery. And Cousins, with the concurrence of his doctors, decided to take a different tack and include laughter in his treatment plan. So he called his friend, Alan Funt of Candid Camera fame, who sent over a movie projector and some classic reels of Candid Camera. He also got a stack of Marx Brothers films and several books of humorous stories, and he made an interesting discovery. 10 minutes of laughter gave him 2 hours of pain-free sleep. And of course, it wasn't until the 1970s when it was scientifically established that the brain produces natural proteins called endorphins, which are morphine-like painkillers. It appears that laughter and in general, any happy, relaxed state produces endorphins. He also found that his sedimentation rate, which is a measure of the severity of infection, went down after he would laugh. So he checked out of the hospital and went into a hotel, which was much cheaper, and continued to watch his Marx Brothers films and Candid Camera and his humorous books. And within 2 weeks, he could move his fingers without pain. And in another 2 weeks, he was off enjoying the beaches of Puerto Rico. Now, over the years, his connective tissue regenerated and he regained normal, healthy functioning. Now, I don't know of any, double-blind scientific studies that has replicated this, but I am really impressed that many hospitals include humor in their healing regimen. The University Hospital in Albuquerque has a program called Humor and Hospitals Are Health Allies, ha ha. At a medical conference in San Francisco, there once was a conference on this topic with presentations such as The Magic of Humor, The Whole Holistic View, and other offerings were Just for the Health of It, or He Who Laughs, Laughs. But humor, as well as religion, function as a medicine, spreading its healing emollients over physical illness, over the threats of fate and guilt. It relaxes tensions and relieves pressures. It often bespeaks courage in the face of adversity. Second, religion and humor jointly serve a critical or prophetic function. At its best, prophetic religion protests against the follies and the foibles and the injustices of human beings. And of course, satire is a branch of humor. And in my history studies, I enjoyed the satires of Erasmus and Swift. Earlier in my life, I was taken with Mort Saul and Dick Gregory and George Carlin. My favorite today is Bill Maher. How many of you take in his program, Bill Maher? I get it at his podcast, and I listen to it as I walk in the morning. I don't miss it ever. But humor with these satirists is a means of insight, disclosure, of revelation. Unlike the religious prophets of old, they follow the advice of George Bernard Shaw. He said, If you want to tell people the truth, make them laugh or they will kill you. So many human stories that come to us are insightful regarding human nature. I'm much taken with President Truman's favorite joke about a fellow who's dying of a terminal disease. He's up in his bedroom and he smells, wafting up, the fact that his wife is making his favorite food, chocolate chip cookies. And so he crawls out of bed on his hands and knees to the stairway, crawls down the stairway on his hands and knees, and reaches up to the kitchen table. And his hand is slapped, and his wife says, "Them's for the wake." Now, how often do we let social conventions and expectations of others intrude on important relationships in time of real distress? That poor guy. I felt so sorry for him. And another story which breaks me up every time I think of it or read it, about a rabbit who's encaged in a research laboratory. He never can get out. He never gets outside. But one day, his cage was open and he got out. And somehow he got outside. He enjoyed the beautiful scenery and the good air and the sunshine. And then he teamed up with some other rabbits who had their freedom. He said, "What do you guys do all day?" He said, "Well, this morning, we're going to go down to our favorite field, which has the best carrots you could imagine." And off he went with them and enjoyed frolicking with them and making new friends after his long time of being in a cage. And they said, "Are you going to stay with us through the afternoon? We go to another field, one of our other favorite places. Please come with us." And he said, "No," he said, "I'm just dying for a cigarette. I got to get back to the lab." And I've wondered, why does that break me up? And I think it reminds me of a human foible. How often addictions really get in the way of our full expression of freedom and joy. The rabbit story. And think of this humorous social commentary from people living in dictatorships. Think of Jose, who lives in a small village in a country ruled by a dictatorship. He goes in to vote. The voting official hands him a sealed envelope and showed him where to deposit in the ballot box. But Jose started to open his sealed ballot. The voting official says, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I want to know who I'm voting for." He said, "Well, don't you know we have a secret ballot in this country?" You get it? Well, those types of stories get spread abroad far and wide. I think of the Native American from out of town who's walking in downtown Chicago, and he's stopped by a Chicagoan who snobbishly asks, "What do you think of our big city?" And the Native American answers, "What do you think of our big country?" Okay. I've enjoyed hearing of the years ago of the underground humor of the Soviet Union during the communist era. A resident of the Soviet Union goes into his Lada dealership and asks to purchase a car. And he's told, "We'll have one for you in 10 years. In 10 years. 10 years from today." And the fellow says, "Well, will that be in the morning or in the afternoon?" And they said, "Well, what difference does that make?" And he said, "Well, the plumber's coming in the morning." Thirdly, both are closely allied to restoring the pompous and the vain to a sense of humility. And sometimes two pompous and vain people play off each other. I love that wonderful Winston Churchill story about how one day in the House of Lords, Lady Astor was particularly put off with him. And she said, "Winston, if you were my husband, I'd poison your coffee." Undaunted, Churchill replied, "If you, my dear lady, were my wife, I'd drink it." And then there's my all-time favorite story about a know-it-all critic getting his comeuppance. A fellow went into his barber to get a haircut before going on vacation. And the barber said, well, where are you going on vacation? Going to Italy. That's the worst place to go in the summer. It's just terribly hot and humid. You'll be miserable. How are you going to get there? Well, we're going Air Italia. That's the worst airline you can possibly take. They're rarely on time. The food is terrible. The stewardesses are rude. Boy, you made a big mistake there. What are you going to do when you're there? Well, we're going to have an audience with the Pope. You'll be lucky to get in within a quarter of a mile of the Pope. If you're lucky enough, he may address you from a balcony. So the guy leaves after his haircut, properly admonished, and then comes back a month later or 2 weeks later for a haircut. And the barber said, how did it go? It was great. We hit the weather just right. The humidity was low. The temperature was great. The flight over was terrific. Food was great. It was on time. Wonderful stewardesses and stewards. Well, did you see the Pope? Yes, we did see the Pope. We had a private audience with him in the Sistine Chapel. I got up in front of him and I knelt down before him, and he put his hand on my head. Well, what did the Pope say? Well, the Pope said, where did you get that crummy haircut? Someone getting their comeuppance. And of course, clergy have been known to suffer from a bit of pomposity, and I take delight in collecting humorous anecdotes about ministers. Two ministers of different denominations were the best of friends, but they all often disagreed about theological issues. And one day they had been arguing a bit more heatedly than usual on some point, and one of them said to the other, it's all right. We'll just agree to disagree. The important thing is that we are both doing the Lord's work. You in your way, and I in his. Or the minister who went in to get his car repaired and said to the mechanic, he said, I hope you'll go easy on the price. After all, I'm just a poor preacher. And the mechanic said, I know, I've heard you preach. And of course, a sermon such as this has to mention all the minister, priest, and rabbi jokes, right? There's so many of them. But my favorite is, the local priest and rabbi and minister enjoyed a friendly game of poker every Wednesday evening. And they played for small monetary stakes. Well, the local policeman heard that there was gambling for monetary stakes going on. So he went to the rectory of the priests and knocked on the door. They hurriedly got rid of the evidence. The policeman said, Father O'Malley, have you been gambling? Oh, no, sir, I wouldn't think of such a thing, officer. Pastor Swenson, have you been gambling? No, sir, I certainly wouldn't do something illegal like that. And he said to the Rabbi Goldman, he said, Rabbi, have you been gambling? He said, with whom? Now, this genre of joke always has the rabbi coming out on top. I've often wondered, why is that so? But that's the case. That's the case. And of course, we think one of the amazing exemplifications of history of clergy making fun of each other and at the church is the Feast of Fools. And I always thought, well, maybe this happened once or twice in history, but Barbara Tuchman, in her book, A Distant Mirror, about the 14th, 16th century, suggests that it was a way for people to get back at the all-pervading colossus of the medieval church. The lower clergy who had to suffer under the higher clergy painted their faces and they strutted about in the robes of their superiors, and they mocked the rituals of the church and of the court. They chanted off-color hymns, they ate sausages and played dice at the altar. Can you believe this? They burned old shoes in censer and preached hilarious sermons, and that went on for years and years and years. The humor of social leveling has been interesting through history as well. There's an old story about the Vermont farmer, a humble fellow who one day appeared at the bank and requested a loan for $1. He was told that this could be arranged, but that it was usual to demand collateral. So the farmer brought in a $10,000 government bond. He was assured that that would work, and soon went off with his dollar. Exactly 1 year later, he came back and said he wanted to renew the loan. And they said, well, you owe us 7%, you owe us 7 cents. So he gave us 7 cents. And he did this year after year. And finally, the bank manager got wind of it, and he asked his staff to bring the farmer to him to see what this was all about. So the farmer stood before the august bank manager, and he said, the manager said, we have nothing against this $1 loan for which you pay 7% interest, but I'm curious, why do you need this dollar loan? And the farmer said, do you know how much you charge for a safety deposit box these days? Well, laughter restores proportion. People can take themselves too seriously. We can stand outside ourselves. Sometimes we can see how comical we are and maybe even laugh at ourselves. I started telling a story about ministers, really offending my adolescent sensibilities. Well, it turns out that being a minister myself, I love that type of stories. And when ministers get together, they share personal, real-life stories, especially stories about rites of passage, about funerals, memorial services, weddings. And I remember hearing a story from my ministerial colleague, Fred Muir, who was in Annapolis, Maryland at the time. But he told a story about when he was minister up in Maine, and he did a funeral service for a man who was not in his congregation, but whom he knew and was very, very impressed with. He had worked with him on several different civil projects. And so when he came time for the eulogy, he was telling about all he appreciated about this fellow. And at one point, this fellow's son got up and said, "You've got it all wrong. He was an SOB." Well, the funeral director went up to the son and tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Would you like to come back for a while in the back?" And he said, "Get your hands off me." Well, I just kept talking. The funeral director went back to the back of the room, left the fellow alone. And so Fred then went on and related something else he appreciated about this man. And the son again got terribly perturbed and yelled out, "He ruined my life." At that point, the funeral director said he would have to be more demonstrative. And so he went up and took the son by the arm and said, "Come with me." Well, the man pulled the funeral director right down into the aisle, and they wrestled on the floor. Fred didn't know what to do. He just kept talking. And finally, the two of them stopped wrestling, brushed themselves off. Son sat down, funeral director went to the back of the room, and he was able to finish the service. Isn't that an interesting story? That it's not necessarily raucous laughter, but it gives me a chuckle from time to time when I think about it. And of course, a sermon like this wouldn't be complete without mentioning Jewish humor and religion. And my favorite Jewish humorous story, religion, is about High Holy Days. And before the services, the rabbi is in front of the ark, and overcome with religious emotion, he yells out, "Oh God, in reference to your divine majesty, I am nothing." And he beats his chest. Well, the cantor sees this, and he's not going to be outdone. So he goes up by the ark and he cries out, "Oh God, in reference to your divine majesty, I am nothing." Well, the shamus, the janitor, he wasn't going to be left out. So he also cried out, "Oh God, in reference to your divine majesty, I am nothing." And the cantor looks at the rabbi and says, "Look who thinks he's nothing." That cracks me up every time I think of or hear about it. And of course, Unitarian Universalists tell jokes on themselves all the time. I could do a whole sermon on UU jokes, but one of my favorites is a woman walks into a fabric store and asks the clerk for 9 yards of filmy material. And the clerk says, "Well, what are you going to make?" And the woman says, well, I'm getting married and I'm making a negligee for myself as a present for my husband. Well, the clerk says, but 9 yards is way too much fabric. You don't need that much. And the woman said, well, you don't understand. I'm marrying a Unitarian Universalist, and they're much more interested in seeking than finding. And you know, we tell that story about ourselves. I think to underline the fact, of course, we do believe to question is the answer, to seek is so important. But each of us has to live day by day in which we make decisions based on our core values, right? And of course, the old saw, what do you get when you cross the Unitarian Universalist and Jehovah's Witness? You know, someone who knocks on your door without any particular reason. But yet again, to me, my experience, if you scratch a Unitarian Universalist before too long, you'll find some pretty deep-seated commitments that people, if they're asked to do, can share those commitments with you. And then I'll tell you, I got to share with you something that I have just enjoyed so much. And that is a book entitled, Dear God, What Religion Were the Dinosaurs? And it's by a fellow who did his doctorate in Harvard on children and religion. His name is David Heller, and this is his second book. But he asked children to just write letters to God, what they would say. And they're humorous, but they're also insightful and so very, very interesting. Dear God, I read how you parted the Red Ocean. That was cool and unbelievable. How come you don't do things spectacular like that anymore? Hard to get up the energy? Or attention, God, please tell Reverend Johnson to stop calling you a him every single time he talks about you. Tell him you're a girl and set him straight. Best wishes, Melissa Sue, age 10. Or, oh God, my father is not very religious. My mom tries to get him to be. My minister says I should try to help. What should I do, God? I read about how every person has to decide alone. You and my minister and my mom must not be on the same wavelength. Keith, age 12. Dear God, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to ask about this, but if you don't mind, Lord, what were you thinking about when you made sex? I hope that it is okay to ask. Love always, Brooke B, age 12. Dear God, why does being Jewish go by what mothers are? My mom told me that, and I don't see why. Are you sexist or what? Sharon, age 12. I want to share a few more with you here. Dear Jesus, come on back. We really need you. And bring a sense of humor. You will need that. Best wishes, Cicely, age 10. Dear God, what do you think about Whitney Houston? I figure she must be real pleased with her gold records and being admired by everyone. Me, I would be satisfied with a chance to go to college when I grow up. That would make me pleased. Please help, God. Kathy, age 10. Dear God, I pray to you before every swim meet, and I like to win. So does my friend Julie. She prays too, but I always beat her. Does that mean you like me best or you don't care about swimming? Maybe she should win at least 1 or 2 times. Love, Missy, age 11. And dear God, why don't you buy a big microphone and loudspeakers so that we can hear you better down here? Think about it, please. We really need some changes. Alexander, age 10. And then, dear God, I know that you made all kinds of people. When I suggested this in religious school, my teacher told me I was wrong. You should be more careful about who you hire to teach your stuff. Yours truly, Marcy, age 11. Aren't those fascinating in the realm of humor and religion? I just think they're great. You know that the whole Jewish Christian tradition got started with a big laugh. One day, God, in the person of three angels, came to Abraham, who was 100 years old, and said, within the year, you and your wife, Sarah, are going to have a son, just like I promised. And he was so overwrought with humor. He just fell on the ground and laughed. And Sarah had been eavesdropping from the tent, and she heard this too. And she said, I'm 90 years old. I'm going to have a child. And she laughed her head off. But you know what happened? Within a year, they had their son. And they named him Isaac. And you know what the word name Isaac means? It means laughter. And you know what I take from this story? Of course, in the Bible, things happen generally the way things are, God says are going to happen. But so often life surprises us with irony. Remember when President Reagan stood at the Berlin Wall and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And I laughed. But a couple of years later, I laughed in another way, that wall was torn down. And my greatest fear from my earliest years was a nuclear holocaust. And that was really changed to a great degree when we stopped targeting each other and actually destroyed a good number of nuclear weapons. Who would ever have thought that that could have happened? Or who would ever have thought that Nelson Mandela would become president of South Africa without a bloodbath? How could I have ever thought, when I was so discouraged after leaving an Orthodox evangelical seminary because I couldn't believe the doctrine, I felt I'd never be able to be a minister. Yet I'm a minister today for over 45 years because I found Unitarian Universalism. I suppose the final ultimate question about human religion, does God have a sense of humor? As a person, as a process, as a creative, as process theologian would say, a creative process over time. Does God have a sense of humor? Well, you and I came out of that vast process. And that means something, right? When you think of it, as I look at all of the humanity and its humorous aspects. So, in this time of turmoil, and this time we're trying to get over this pandemic and it still kind of hangs on, and as we mourn the losses in Ukraine, let's give ourselves some time for comic relief. Let's tell our favorite stories to each other, even in the midst of a time of trial. So may it be. Amen.